The wailing of La Coma. The wind howled through the narrow, twisting streets of La Coma, a village long forgotten by time, where crumbling houses hunched beneath the weight of the mountains. It was a place soaked in shadows, where dusk seemed to linger longer, and the veil between the living and the dead was thin as smoke. The townsfolk had long since learned to live with their fear. For generations they whispered of the Banshee, the mujer de llanto, whose cry echoed through the night before death visited. No one saw her but those cursed to die, and no one heard her wail but the doomed, though everyone knew when she had appeared. It was the old woman who had seen her last. Marta, aged and bent, had been seen sitting on the edge of her porch in the days before her death, her eyes glazed, staring at something unseen. She spoke little in those final days, but the children swore they heard her mumbling to the wind, as if in conversation. It was only when her body was found cold and contorted in her bed that the villagers nodded knowingly. The Banshee had come again, but there was no mourning in La Coma, no weeping, only fear of who she would come for next. Late one night, Thomas the blacksmith stood at the hearth of his dimly lit forge, the glowing embers casting long, trembling shadows on the walls. He was a man of few words, his hands as rough as the iron he worked, his eyes hardened by years of toil. Thomas had no family, no one to love him and no one to mourn him when the time came. His was a solitary existence, like most in La Coma. That night, as he shaped steel, a cold shiver crept up his spine. The flames in the hearth flickered, shrinking back as if afraid of something unseen. Thomas paused. His breath caught in his throat. From the far end of the street, barely audible over the howling wind, came a sound that chilled his blood, a soft, mournful cry. His hammer clattered to the ground, forgotten. He knew what it was. Every soul in La Coma knew. The Banshee. His heart thundered in his chest, and the forge seemed to close in on him. He could feel her presence in the very air, cold and suffocating. Slowly, he turned toward the doorway, the shadows thickening as the wail rose, louder now, closer. Thomas staggered outside, the chill night air wrapping around him like a death shroud. The village was silent, too silent. The usual rustling of leaves and distant chatter of night birds had fallen still. His eyes darted to the alleyways, expecting to see her, the spectre of death. And there she was, at the end of the darkened street, standing beneath the skeletal limbs of a gnarled tree, was the Banshee. Her form was pale, nearly translucent, her long dark hair matted and tangled, hanging in damp, heavy strands. Her eyes, hollow and black, stared directly into Thomas's soul. She wore a tattered white gown, stained with mud and dried blood, fluttering in the wind that seemed to only touch her. Her mouth opened wide, her face contorted in eternal grief, and from her lips came that unearthly, bone-chilling wail, a sound that spoke of despair, of endings, of the grave. Thomas froze, unable to move, his mind reeling as her wail echoed through the street. His breath came in ragged gasps, but he knew his time had come. He tried to run, but his legs betrayed him, crumbling beneath him as he fell to the ground. His vision blurred, the world spinning in a dizzying whirl of fear and darkness. The Banshee's wail seemed to wrap around him, pulling him deeper into despair, into oblivion. From the corner of his eye, he saw her moving toward him, drifting silently over the ground, her feet never touching the earth. Her eyes were locked on his, and her wail, God, that terrible, mournful wail, grew louder, louder still, until it was all he could hear. When they found Thomas the next morning, he was slumped against the doorway of his forge, eyes wide open, his face twisted in a grotesque mask of terror. His heart had stopped, they said, though no one dared speak of the cause. The village knew. The Banshee had taken another. In the weeks that followed, no one spoke much in La Coma. The forge stood cold and the streets were emptier than usual. People moved quickly, eyes cast downward, speaking in hushed tones, wary of hearing that terrible wail. But life in La Coma, as it always did, continued. until the Banshee came again. The cycle was eternal, they said. The wailing spirit, forever bound to the cursed village, would never rest. Death was her only companion, and she would come for them all, one by one. They all knew, they always knew. La Coma was not a village for the living.